Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into something pretty fascinating.
Oh.
It's this whole intersection of politics and propaganda and personality.
Oh, yeah.
You've got a whole stack of sources to go
Yeah.
through, covering everything from Hitler's early political moves in 1920s Germany all the way up to Trump's use of Twitter in the 21st century.
We're even going to be taking a look at the financial backers of both of those regimes.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a tangled web.
Yeah, tangled web.
Okay, so by the end of this deep dive, you'll have a more nuanced understanding of how figures like Hitler and Trump used specific tactics like storytelling, enemy creation, even humor to build their power bases and connect with followers.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is how those tactics, though they were employed in vastly different contexts, still echo across time.
They really do. It's amazing.
Okay.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's rewind back to Hitler's early days.
Okay.
One of the things that jumped out at me from the research was that Hitler was initially rejected by the very party that he later came to lead, the Deutsche Sozialistische Partei.
Right. And that rejection actually reveals a lot about Hitler's unwavering commitment to his specific vision. He was not interested in compromise.
Yeah.
He resigned from that party because they wanted to merge with another party and move their headquarters to Berlin.
Oh, wow.
He insisted on Munich as the base, and he was absolutely uncompromising on his racial ideology.
So he has this almost like preternatural sense of destiny, even back then.
There's definitely an element of that, and he seemed to genuinely believe that as things got worse for the German people, that they would naturally flock to his ideas. So he took this attentist approach, meaning that he just believed that waiting would actually work in his favor.
Interesting. Okay, so then we have the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923, which, let's be honest, was a total disaster.
Yeah, it was a failed coup, for sure.
Yeah.
But even in that failure, Hitler began solidifying his narrative, his whole us versus them mentality.
Right. He blamed the failure on separatists and Jews, and he essentially turned a personal defeat into fuel for his political agenda.
Exactly. And then even during his time in Landsberg prison for his role in that push, Hitler continued to wield influence. He wrote Mein Kampf, of course, and he further shaped the Nazi movement and solidified his image as the central figure.
It's remarkable.
It really is.
Okay, so at this point, he's got this compelling, albeit dangerous, narrative,
Yeah.
and he's positioning himself as a strong leader. But how does he go from imprisoned agitator to, well, Hitler?
That's where the propaganda machine really kicks in.
Yeah.
We have to talk about Leni Riefenstahl and her film Triumph of the Will.
Yeah.
This film is a masterpiece in crafting Hitler's image.
It's considered one of the most effective pieces of propaganda ever made.
Right.
But what made it so powerful, I mean, it's just a film.
Well, it's so much more than just a film.
Right.
Riefenstahl was a brilliant filmmaker, and she used every tool at her disposal. Dramatic camera angles, soaring music, carefully choreographed mass rallies, you name it.
Yeah.
It created this almost religious experience for the viewer.
And she presented Hitler as both a man of the people, but also this almost godlike leader.
Right.
Almost a savior figure for the German nation.
Yeah, she captured him interacting with children, attending rallies, looking contemplative and statesmanlike, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
It was a visual mythology that made him relatable and extraordinary.
It did. Relatable, yet extraordinary.
Exactly.
Fast forward to the 21st century, and we see a similar kind of image crafting,
Yeah.
but on a completely different platform. Twitter.
Yeah, Trump's use of Twitter was truly revolutionary in the political landscape. He bypassed traditional media, he crafted his own narrative, and he spoke directly to his base, and he tweeted a lot.
Prolifically. But it was more than just volume.
Right.
He was a master of using conflict-based storytelling and humor to build a really devoted following.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He was constantly picking fights on Twitter, using insults and jokes to entertain his followers and demonize his opponents. And much like Hitler's rallies, it created this sense of belonging, this in-group that felt like they were all in on the joke, laughing at the expense of the enemy.
That is a very interesting parallel.
Yeah.
So we've got Hitler with his carefully cultivated image through film and rallies and photography.
Right.
And then Trump, decades later, doing something similar through Twitter. So it seems like image control is a huge part of this equation.
It's absolutely central.
Yeah.
They understood that perception is reality in politics, and they both excelled at presenting themselves as these larger-than-life figures,
Yeah.
champions of the common man, fighters against a corrupt system, the whole 9 yards.
Right. But there's another layer to this. that we need to explore
Yeah.
the financial aspect.
Right.
Because every movement needs its patrons, its financial backers. So who was bankrolling Hitler's rise to power?
Well, there's one name that looms large. IG Farben.
IG Farben, that rings a bell.
Yeah.
They were involved in some pretty shady stuff during World War II.
Unfortunately, yes, but their support of the Nazi Party goes way back to the early days. We don't have all the details because, conveniently, a lot of records detailing the extent of their support were destroyed at the end of the war.
Classic cover-up.
Right.
But what we do know is that IG Farben saw the Nazi Party as a way to advance their own interests, both financially and politically.
Exactly, and they weren't the only ones.
Really?
Yes, there's evidence that other foreign institutions, even some in the United States, were involved in supporting the Nazi regime.
No way, really?
Yeah, take the Schroeder Bank, for instance. It
What?
was a very prominent German bank with international ties.
Hmm.
And there are accounts linking individuals like John Foster Dulles, who later became Secretary of State under Eisenhower, to the financing of the Nazi regime.
Wow, that's a bombshell.
It is. And it just goes to show how complex these systems of power can be and how intertwined they are with financial interests.
Yeah, it reminds us to always look beyond the surface, to follow the money, as they say.
Exactly.
Okay, this has been an incredible start to our deep dive. We've already uncovered so much about how these figures used propaganda and carefully crafted narratives to build their power base.
Absolutely.
And I think we're just getting started. Stay with us for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into the psychology of storytelling and the echoes of these tactics throughout history.
I can't wait to unpack it further.
Me too.
Yeah.
All right, we'll be right back.
So we've been talking about Hitler and Trump and, their mastery of image and narrative.
Right.
But what's really fascinating is the psychological power behind these tactics,
Yeah.
especially storytelling.
Okay, so let's dive into that.
Okay.
Why is storytelling so effective in the realm of politics? It's not like we're talking about bedtime stories here.
No, but in a way, it's not that different. Humans are wired for stories.
Right.
We relate to narratives much more readily than we do to abstract concepts or data.
That makes sense.
Yeah, a good story can really grab your attention and stay with you long after you've heard it.
Absolutely.
And both Hitler and Trump understood this instinctively. They were both incredibly skilled storytellers, weaving narratives that resonated with people's deepest fears and desires.
Like Hitler's whole narrative about Germany's humiliation after World War I and the need for national revival.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It tapped into this existing sense of resentment and national pride.
Yeah.
And of course, he had his scapegoats, conveniently blaming Jews and other minorities for Germany's problems.
It's scary how effective that kind of tactic can be.
It is, because when you present a complex problem,
Right.
and then you offer a simple solution, often by identifying an enemy,
Yeah.
people are more likely to latch on to that narrative, especially if it confirms their existing biases.
Right. It's like you're giving them permission to feel justified in their anger and fear.
Exactly. And that's incredibly dangerous because it creates this sort of partnership and wishful thinking between the leader and the followers. They feed off of each other's emotions,
Right.
creating this echo chamber of confirmation bias.
So it's not just about the story itself, but also the emotional connection
Right.
that's created between the leader and the followers.
Precisely. And this is something we see with Trump as well,
Yeah.
though the narrative is different.
Right.
His story is about America losing its greatness, about being cheated and taken advantage of by other countries, by immigrants, by the so-called elites.
It's the Make America Great Again narrative.
Exactly.
This idea that we need to return to some idealized past.
Exactly. And he used Twitter to tell that story, to connect with his followers on an emotional level, to make them feel like he was one of them, fighting for them against a common enemy.
And it worked.
It did.
He tapped into this existing sense of anxiety and anger,
Yeah.
particularly among white working-class voters who felt left behind by globalization and social change.
Absolutely. He gave them someone to blame for their problems, someone to fight for them,
Yeah.
and a simple solution, a return to greatness. It's a powerful formula, and it's one that's been used by demagogues throughout history.
And this ties back to what we were discussing earlier about image control.
Right.
Both Hitler and Trump were masters of crafting a persona
Yes.
that resonated with their target audience.
Right. Hitler's photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, captured him in all sorts of stage scenarios, interacting with children, attending rallies,
Right.
looking contemplative and statesmanlike.
Essentially creating a visual mythology around him,
Yeah.
making him seem both relatable and extraordinary.
Exactly. And Trump, of course, had his reality TV persona, which he cultivated for years on The Apprentice.
Right.
He was already this larger-than-life figure, this successful businessman who wasn't afraid to speak his mind.
And that image carried over seamlessly into his political career.
It
He
did.
was already a celebrity,
Right.
already a brand before he even announced his candidacy.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
He didn't have to build that persona from scratch. He already had it, and he leveraged it brilliantly.
It's like he was made for the age of social media,
Right.
where image and personality often trump substance and policy.
Exactly. And let's not forget the financial schemes
Right.
that were tied to Hitler's image.
Right.
Those photos that Hoffman was taking weren't just for propaganda purposes.
Right. They were selling those images everywhere.
Yeah.
Postcards, posters, even photo albums.
It was a brilliant way to spread the Nazi message and line their pockets at the same time. They understood the power of merchandising,
Right.
of creating a cult of personality around Hitler.
And we see similar tactics with Trump, though in a more modern context.
Right.
Think about his branding empire. Trump Steaks, Trump Water, Trump University.
He built his entire career on selling his name,
Yeah.
his image, his brand.
Right.
And it was incredibly effective.
Yeah.
He convinced millions of people that his name was synonymous with success, with wealth, with power.
And that's a potent image, especially in a culture that often equates wealth with merit.
Absolutely. And it allowed him to tap into this deeply ingrained belief that if you're rich, you must be smart, you must be successful,
Right.
you must be someone worth listening to.
It's a fascinating and somewhat disturbing insight into how these figures were able to manipulate not just image and narrative,
Right.
but also people's deep-seated beliefs and values.
It's a reminder that we need to be critical thinkers,
Yeah.
to be aware of the tactics that are being used to influence us, and to be skeptical of those who promise simple solutions to complex problems.
It's really eye-opening to see how these tactics, even across such different time periods, can be so effective. You know, it makes you wonder if there are certain types of narratives that just resonate more deeply with people, especially during times of like crisis or uncertainty.
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. And I think you're on to something there. When societies are facing upheaval, whether it's economic hardship or social change or political instability, people crave simple explanations and easy answers and a sense of belonging.
Right.
And charismatic leaders who offer those things, even if they're based on false promises or dangerous ideologies, can be incredibly appealing.
So it's almost like a perfect storm. You have this vulnerable population seeking solace and solutions, and then you have these figures who are masters of manipulating those anxieties and desires.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for, well, disaster in some cases.
It can be, unfortunately, but it's not inevitable.
Right.
We don't have to fall prey to these kinds of manipulative tactics. The first step is awareness, recognizing that these tactics exist and being able to identify them when we see them.
So being more media literate, basically. Being aware of how information is being presented and framed,
Yeah.
especially in the age of social media where everyone has a platform and anyone can be an influencer.
Exactly. We can't just blindly accept everything we read or hear. We need to be critical thinkers, question assumptions, and seek out multiple perspectives. And we need to be wary of emotional appeals, especially those that prey on our fears or prejudices.
Because those are often the most effective ways to manipulate people.
Mm.
If someone's trying to make you angry or afraid, it's probably because they're trying to get you to act without thinking.
Right. They're trying to bypass your rational mind and appeal to your gut instincts, which can be incredibly powerful but also easily misled.
So how can we be more rational, more discerning in our political decision-making? It feels like we're constantly bombarded with information, much of it designed to manipulate us.
It's definitely a challenge. One thing we can do is focus on policies rather than personalities.
Okay.
Look beyond the charisma and the rhetoric and ask, what are the candidates' actual plans? What are their track records? What are the potential consequences of their proposals?
That's a great point.
Uh.
It's easy to get swept up in the excitement of a campaign, the rallies, the slogans, but ultimately, we need to remember that leaders are there to serve the people, not themselves. And their policies will have a much greater impact on our lives than their personality.
Precisely. And another thing we can do is engage in respectful dialogue with people who hold different political views.
Yeah.
Even if we disagree with someone, we can still learn from them.
Sometimes those can be the most challenging, but also the most rewarding conversations, right?
Absolutely. It's easy to stay in our echo chambers, surrounded by people who agree with us, but that doesn't really challenge our thinking or broaden our understanding. We need to be willing to step outside of our comfort zones and engage with different perspectives.
And remember, it's not about winning the argument or changing someone's mind. It's about listening, understanding, and finding common ground.
Well said. And finally, and this is crucial, we need to be willing to hold our leaders accountable, regardless of their political party. Power can be intoxicating, and it's easy for those in positions of authority to lose sight of their responsibilities.
Right. We can't just blindly follow our leaders, no matter how charismatic or persuasive they may be. We need to hold their feet to the fire and demand better. Ultimately, it's our responsibility to create the kind of world we want to live in.
That's a powerful message. We're not just passive observers, we're active participants in shaping our own destinies, both individually and collectively.
I love that. So to wrap things up, I think what we've learned today is that while history may not repeat itself exactly, it certainly rhymes. And by understanding the tactics used by figures like Hitler and Trump, we can be more discerning, more critical, and more empowered to make informed decisions and hold our leaders accountable.
I couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power, and by understanding how these systems work, we can be more effective citizens and advocates for a more just and equitable world.
This has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today. Don't forget to subscribe and share Join Allison Knows on Spotify and YouTube.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, dear listener, for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and often unsettling world of politics, propaganda, and personality. Thank you for listening to the Allison Knows podcast. Follow Allison on Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok.